Okay, so the usual, we will just give it a couple of minutes.
Okay, not a problem.
We'll start in 2 minutes, okay, Haran?
Okay. Yes.
Hi, morning, Racine. Thank you for joining us.
Okay, Racine is joining us. That's good. Anybody else joining us?
We have a few other people, but let's give some others
Okay.
some
All right, no problem, sure. Well, good morning to those who've joined us so far.
Tracy just gave us a little shout
Okay.
out. Okay, so let's go ahead and
Sure.
get this started. Right.
Okay,
So good
certainly.
morning. Good morning to you, Haran, and good morning to all our viewers. Welcome to our Q&A session.
Yes, good morning, Shelley.
This morning we'll be answering all of your questions. There is no specific theme for this week, right? So as we close off, you know your right series for the year. You can ask questions from any of the topics that we've covered or not covered, anything that you're curious about, and you simply just want answered, right? So, Haran, while we wait for the questions to come in, I would like to chat a bit about human rights.
Certainly, yes.
Right? So on 10th December, right, all United Nations member states observe Human Rights Day.
Yes.
At the Commission, we issued a release. We published a column in the Newsday that spoke about where we are as a nation in terms of human rights and being honest with ourselves in terms of whether or not this is the path that we want to continue, right? So the 2021 theme is equality, reducing inequalities, advancing human rights, right?
Yes.
So let's continue where we left off and have a chat about human rights until the questions start coming in.
Okay,
so,
yes.
Haran,
Yes.
let's get to the basics. What are human rights?
Well, human rights, as the name suggests, are rights and freedoms that all human beings enjoy. It is the rights that all of us enjoy just by virtue of being a human being. For example, in human rights theory, they're described along 4 parameters. They are inherent, they're universal, they're inalienable, and they're interdependent. So, for example, inherent, we all of us inherently have a right to our religion, to speak our language, that sort of thing. regardless of your nationality, your place of residence, regardless of your sex. And that's the concept about inherency, that it does not depend on these sorts of things, so that all persons have these rights regardless of whether, you know, what your race, your sex, your gender, that sort of thing. We are all entitled to these things. It is considered to be universal because all persons in all countries should enjoy it. Now, we know that in actuality that doesn't happen. But the belief is that, for example, the right to vote, I mean, that should be a right enjoyed by all persons in all countries. The right to own property, we know that in some countries in this world, women can't own property, women can't drive cars, women can't vote. But we believe in human rights theories that there is no reason to say that rights should only be enjoyed by men as opposed to women. It should be universal, that all persons, whether you're male or female, whether you're black or white, you should be entitled to these sorts of rights. It should not be limited by reason of your race or your sex. It is inalienable. That's the third characteristic I mentioned, because it should not be taken away or transferred except in specific situations, and normally by due process. And a classic example would be the right to liberty. We all say we have the right to liberty, but you can lose your right to liberty if you are convicted of a crime by a court of law. Now, that is the only way your right to liberty can be taken away from you. The state just can't turn up at your house as, we always hear this story about these, remember the Tonton Macoute in Haiti and all of these secret police in Eastern European countries that just turn up at your house and carry you off to some gulag in Russia, in Siberia, those were things that were characteristic of those regimes. So we believe that you can't lose your right to liberty, your right to freedom, unless there is some sort of a due process of law, that is to say you've been charged and convicted of a crime. And we say that it is interdependent, the fourth characteristic, because you can't say you have one right and not the other. And a classic example, you can't say you have the right to freedom of expression, but you don't have the right to freedom of the press. It'll be facetious of a state or an entity to say we're giving you one right, but we're taking away another. So these are the four characteristics that we look at in terms of human rights. That they're inherent, they're inherent to all of us. They're universal in that there's no reason, in actuality, this doesn't happen, but there's no reason why all persons everywhere can't enjoy the same rights and freedoms. They're inalienable in that they can't be taken away from you just like that. There must be some sort of a due process, and they're interdependent in that rights, they buttress and they support each other, and and one can't exist in isolation of the other.
Yes. Okay. Thank you for that, Haran. That was very comprehensive. I just wanted to say good morning to Nicholas Campbell, who is also joining us this morning.
Okay, good morning, Nicholas. Yes.
And also remember, you can ask us any questions. And when I say us, I use it very loosely. You can ask Haran any question, and we would address it to you this morning. Haran, in terms of the Equal Opportunity Act, how does that fit in with human rights? How does the Act address human rights?
Well, the primary source of human rights in Trinidad and Tobago is the Constitution. The Constitution, as sections 4B and D, sections 4 and 5, not B and D, section 4 and 5 guarantees certain fundamental human rights. And we know that these sections are entrenched, and legislation cannot take away from these rights unless, for example, they are passed by a special majority, so that these rights are considered to be deeply entrenched. And these rights will be things like the right to life, liberty, the right to ownership of property, the freedom of the press, these sorts of things. These are section 4 rights. Section 4 rights are what are called civil and political rights, in that these rights seek to restrict the power of the state and the power of the government. A nice way of thinking about these rights are that the government, in order to enforce these rights, the government has to do nothing. That is, in other words, let's look at the right to freedom of the press. It is a right that the state has to observe, and the state observes it by not interfering with the press. Right. So in other words, if the state does nothing right now and takes no action, then you can say that the right is being enforced. In other words, the newspapers are free to report. Journalists are not being threatened by the state. It's not like, like what you hear happening in North Korea and Cuba, where, if a reporter writes something contrary to the to the wishes of Kim Jong-un or Il, I can't remember his name. You know, the next thing you know, they disappear, they're taken to a prison, that sort of thing. No, so as long as the state does nothing and allows the journalists to write their stories, then then the right to freedom of the press is observed. The right at Section 5 of the Constitution are what you call more specific rights, and we tend to refer to these as criminal rights or rights of due process. For example, it speaks of the right to the presumption of innocence, the right to a trial by jury, you know, these sorts of things. So these are rights that if you are charged with a criminal offense, you have certain protections given to you. So these are the sorts of rights that the Constitution gives to us. But there are other kinds of rights that may not exist under the Constitution, but they are rights nonetheless. Now, just to explain, if your rights under the Constitution are being violated, you go to court and you file what is known as a constitutional motion. You regularly hear that you know, you're going to file a constitutional motion to challenge it or challenge that. What you're basically saying is that the state or some agency or entity of the state has done some action that violates some of these rights, certain rights. But there are other kinds of rights that may exist that don't necessarily fall under the Constitution. It doesn't mean that they're not human rights. It simply means that they're just not constitutional rights. And a classic example I like to refer to is the Maternity Protection Act. The Maternity Protection Act gives protection to pregnant women, to women who are pregnant and who become, you know, nursing mothers. Their right to confinement, their right to return to work without being discriminated against. Now, this is not per se a constitutional right, but it has to be seen as a human right, because we can go on to, you know, a whole discussion about the human reproductive function, and it is seeking to protect and guard the human reproductive function, which is essential for the progress of society. So there are lots of rights that exist outside of the Constitution, and the short point I'm trying to get at is that the Equal Opportunity Act is an example of human rights that exist outside of the Constitution. One of the things about the constitutional rights that I need to stick a pin, and I believe I mentioned this, but I need to reinforce it. The constitutional rights exist as between the individual and the state. So, for example, a person cannot allege that a private sector entity is violating their right to freedom of the press. You can't say, for example, I'm just calling a name, you know, the Ansa McAl Group or Guardian Life or Neela Massey, they're infringing the right to freedom of the press, or your right to liberty, or your right to free expression. These rights really exist as between the state. In other words, the state is prohibited from limiting the freedom of the press. The state is prohibited from limiting your freedom of expression. One of the interesting things about the rights under the Equal Opportunity Act, and for example, the rights under the Maternity Protection Act, is that it exists between the individual and for example, the employer, and the employer need not be a state body. So, for example, the same companies I just mentioned, Neela Massey, Guardian Life, Ansa McAl, they are mandated to observe the rights under the Maternity Protection Act. Similarly, with the Equal Opportunity Commission, the Equal Opportunity Act creates certain rights with respect to equality and non-discrimination. And these rights exist against both the state and against the private sector. So I hope that explains this in a bit of a nutshell. I don't want to go too heavily into, you know, a law school discussion on human rights, but I'm trying to just put it very simply, that this is where the Equal Opportunity Act fits into the whole, what I would call the whole pantheon of human rights, that it is not a constitutional right, but it is part of the human rights of the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago.
Yes, thank you, Haran, and good morning to Abby, who's joining us as well. Haran, so as you spoke about the Constitution and the obligations of the state and so on, outside of the Constitution, outside of the Equal Opportunity Act, is TNT a signatory to any policy document, any legislation as it relates to human rights?
Yes. Trinidad and Tobago has signed a number of international treaties on human rights. The leading treaties would be the United Nations treaties and the Inter-American treaties. Now, it's important to just mention, though, that the only rights that are, I forgot to mention, and treaties and conventions of the International ILO, International Labour Organization. Although one may tend to see the ILO as subsumed within the wider UN system. But it's important to, just to go back, for example, the Maternity Protection Act came out of an ILO convention that the state of Trinidad and Tobago had signed. I can't remember the number offhand because ILO conventions are numbered number 1, number 2, number 110, 111. I can't remember, but you could Google it and see there is an ILO convention on maternity protection. And Trinidad and Tobago enforced that ILO convention by enacting the Maternity Protection Act. And I think that is actually a good example of what I was trying to say, that although Trinidad and Tobago signed conventions, these conventions are not really binding on the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago. The citizens of Trinidad and Tobago don't really have recourse under these conventions because really and truly these conventions signal a desire by the state or an intention by the state, but the state has to bring this intention to life by enacting legislation to give force to these conventions. So that's really and truly the only real rights that you have are the right, or whatever rights that exist under legislation in Trinidad and Tobago, such as the Constitution, the maternity protection, the EOA. But just to go back to what the question you would ask about some of the rights, some of the conventions that the state has signed on to. We had signed on to the American Convention on Human Rights, but then we withdrew from this convention because although I said these citizens don't have rights under the convention, some conventions allow for complaint mechanisms. And this American Convention on Human Rights, the Inter-American Convention, allowed persons who felt that they were aggrieved to make reports to the Inter-American Committee on Human Rights. During the tenure of Mr. Ramesh Lawrence Maraj, when he was Attorney General, he withdrew Trinidad and Tobago from this convention because, to be perfectly blunt, he wanted to implement the death penalty. And a lot of persons who were prisoners on death row were petitioning the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights to intervene. And he felt that that intervention was causing undue delay in the judicial process. So the Inter-American Convention was one of the very few conventions where citizens had some sort of access for redress. And the Trinidad and Tobago had withdrawn from that. But most of the other conventions, like the United Nations Convention, there's really no direct access of redress. Right. For example, but now Trinidad and Tobago has signed on to at least 6 United Nations conventions. There is the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights, which we had signed on to in December 1978. There's the International Convention on Social and Economic Rights, which we also signed on to in December 1978. And there are 4 other UN conventions that we signed on to. For example, the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, which is called CEDAW, the Conventions on the Rights of the Child, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, and the conventions on the rights of persons with disabilities. That is the CRPD. And there are really 2 processes that are involved. There's what is called signing and ratifying. So signing simply means that you sign on, that you agree to the principles contained there and that you think it's a good idea, that sort of thing. Ratifying is really where you sign it again. If I were to be facetious and draw an example, it's like getting vaccinated. There's your first vaccine shot and your second vaccine shot. So you're ratifying is like your second vaccine shot. It's where you're saying, I want to be bound, or I want to show a deeper level of commitment to what is contained in this convention. So for example, I have some information here. CEDAW, we signed in December 1985 and we ratified in January 1990. The Convention on Racial Discrimination, we signed in June 1967 and we ratified in October 1973. The Conventions on the Rights of the Child, we signed in September 1990 and we ratified in December 1991. And the Convention on the Rights of the Persons with Disabilities, we signed in September 2007 and we ratified in June 2015.
All right, thanks for that, Haran. For those of us, good morning, Lorelei. For those of us who are just joining us, we are taking your questions this morning, but we're just having a little discussion about human rights. Last week, Friday, we observed Human Rights Day. So until the questions start coming in, we're just using the opportunity to raise awareness and educate the public on human rights. Haran, so in addition to the Constitution, in addition to the treaties that we've signed, the Equal Opportunity Act and so on, do you think in terms of human rights as a country that there are some areas we are struggling, and not just the country, on planet Earth as well?
Well, going back to the United Nations systems, part of our obligation under these conventions is to submit reports. So for example, we have in the Ministry of the Attorney General, there's a department that actually compiles reports every few years and submits to these United Nations bodies, and they review these bodies. And they had identified at least 3 major thematic areas where they felt that we needed to improve our human rights systems. One was the rights of the LGBTQ community.
Yeah.
That's a hot topic area because, there are now, just a few months ago, the Attorney General made a comment that is accessible on Google, that there are about 27 laws that impact negatively against LGBTQ persons. For example, let's look at the Domestic Violence Act. Same-sex couples cannot make a complaint or cannot access redress under the Domestic Violence Act. They're not recognized as partners under the Cohabitational Relations Act. They're not recognized as partners in case of death or succession rights or intestacy, to be entitled to the property of the other person. So this is one area that they felt that we were lacking, that we needed to, step up with. And another main area that they felt that we needed to step up with was the state of our criminal justice system. That the Constitution does not guarantee a right to a speedy trial, and there are judgments of the Privy Council that explain this. So you don't have a right to a quick trial, but you have a right to a fair trial. But what has been happening is that you have persons, for example, sitting on death row for over 10 years, waiting for a trial, so that they felt that the state of the criminal justice system is an area that really needed looking into, for the state to take the necessary steps to perhaps see how you can, reduce this waiting period, because it is important to understand, sorry, not sitting on death row, what am I saying? They're sitting on remand yard, waiting for trial, because death row is different. Death row means you've been convicted of murder. So I need to clarify that.
Thank you.
Because a person who's on remand yard under the Constitution is presumed innocent until proven guilty. Remember, you are on remand yard awaiting trial. And you have under the Constitution, a person who has not been convicted is presumed innocent until proven guilty. So the concern is that you have innocent people essentially locked up in jail for 10 years or 15 years, who have not, because they're innocent, simply meaning they have not been convicted of a crime. They're simply awaiting trial. Yes.
Yes. Harry said 3. What's it for the LGBTI plus criminal justice system? What's it?
Yes, I can't remember the third area right now, but yes, but I remember there was a third area but those are the 2 hot topic areas really.
Yeah. And just to clarify from the Commission's end that addition of the LGBTI plus as a status ground in the Act was actually recommended to the Attorney General for the Act to be amended to include that status ground.
Yes.
And also, I mean, you mentioned the criminal justice system, but in terms of the Commission, we deal with civil, not criminal.
Yes.
And I wanted to also say, because a lot of people, they tend to downplay conciliation and the benefits of conciliation, but I think it's something we absolutely should not downplay. Conciliation follows the civil proceeding rules in terms of access to justice, quick turnover time, and all of those things. So I just wanted to point out that conciliation, we're doing our part in our own way to ensure that people get a speedy, we resolve their matters speedily. All right. Haran, hold on. I had another question for you. It may seem like a really simple question. I know the answer might not be as simple, but what are the benefits of human rights for all?
Well, human rights gives each of us a measure of expectation, that we know what we can expect from our state, and in turn it gives us a measure of dignity and self-worth. For example, if you live in a society where you don't have freedom of the press or you don't have freedom of expression, it means that you cannot express yourself, you cannot hold, or you cannot express views publicly, and the ability to express ourselves is part of is part of who we are as persons. If it gives you like the criminal rights, as I call it, gives you substantial protection against the arbitrary powers of the state. So, for example, you just cannot be arrested by the police, or not even arrested, but taken by the police and thrown into a cell, and I use the example of the Russian gulags, and kept there until you disappear and your family knows nothing about your whereabouts. So that for example, so using those simple examples, it means that I can feel free to walk the streets, knowing that the state cannot do these things to me. And one might say, well, a criminal could do that to you, but it's important to understand, and I keep stressing, human rights exist as between yourself and the state. So that, yes, I know we all concerned about criminal elements, but at the same time, we can feel safe that the police or the overreaching powers of the state can't do to us like what the state of what North Korea, for example, and those sorts of countries, and the old Eastern Bloc countries and Russia would do to their citizens.
Yes, thank you for that, Haran. And we're actually nearing the half-hour mark to close off our session today. And of course, this is our last session for the year. Haran, before we go, do you have any recommendations what we can do beyond state level, what we can do as individuals or community or as a community to break the cycle of discrimination?
Well, a simple example, a simple thing I always like to say, just think about yourself and the dignity that you hold for yourself, and treat others with that dignity. What would you want for yourself? Would you want to go to a place of employment where you are being discriminated against based on your race, based on your religion, based on your, all of these characteristics, based on where you come from? And if you don't want that for yourself, then you should not treat other persons in that manner. So that, instead of trying to, I always like to say, there's that famous saying that the largest change begins with the smallest person. Yeah. So that while, yes, I believe in advocacy, while I believe that in working within your organization, in clamoring for change, they say, be the change that you want to be. Yes. So that, so that if you treat others with the dignity that you would like for yourself, then I think that would go a long way in perhaps, if each person were to do that, then I think that would go a long way in to sound very cliche, the old Eric Clapton song, if I can change the world, that will go a long way towards doing that.
Thank you so much, Haran. And of course, absolutely, I concur 100% with what you're saying. So we're going to close off the session today. Thank you those for joining us. We didn't get any questions, but I guarantee questions will stream in after we post it live to Facebook, and we encourage you to ask those questions, and we will respond to them for you. Right, so just to recap what we went through today, Haran spoke about human rights, which basically are our rights simply because we're human beings, right? So, and they're universal rights, and they're inherent to all of us regardless of our status. Right, so that, Haran, do you have any messages for our viewers, seeing that it's the last session of the year before we close off?
No, other than I wish everyone a safe Christmas and a happy New Year. While we're talking about human rights, you also need to take care for your health and safety and during this difficult time. And hopefully you can join us next year for further conversation.
Yes, thank you so much, Haran. Thank you for always answering the call whenever we need to get some expert advice and coming on our Facebook Live series. Thank you for everybody who has always been joining us and asking your questions. Mikey Williams is asking for contact information for either of us. You can contact me at communications@eoc.gov.tt. You can contact Haran at complaints@eoc.gov.tt, and I will type the phone number with the extension numbers into the chat for you, Mikey Williams, so you can get it there. So until next year, everybody stay safe, take care, and have a great holiday season.
Okay, take care, everyone.